The void above Tarsis VI was deceptively calm, a black canvas dotted with the faint glimmer of distant stars. For centuries, the planet had been a quiet, industrious world of the Imperium, its forests filled with lumber and its mines heavy with ores. Life on Tarsis VII had been hard but predictable. Its people were loyal to the Emperor, their lives a careful rhythm of work, worship, and survival. Yet now, in the orbital defense station that loomed like a sentinel in the upper atmosphere, Lieutenant Captain Varan felt an unease he had not known in decades of service. He stood before the scanning array, fingers tapping nervously on the console as he studied the readings. At first, the signals had seemed like a simple anomaly, tiny, erratic spikes in signature readings scattered across the planet. But over the weeks, those spikes had grown into something that filled entire sectors. The sensors recorded organic signatures unlike anything in Imperial databases. They were massive, coordinated, and undeniably intelligent. Varan's brow furrowed. What in the Emperor's name? He muttered under his breath. Around him, the officers worked in tense silence, exchanging nervous glances. Reports had already begun trickling in from the surface. Mining outposts on the northern continent had gone dark. Patrol teams sent to investigate never returned. Communications with several cities flickered with strange, intermittent noises, unintelligible chittering, and squeals that seemed almost alive. At first, the Inquisitors dismissed the anomalies as technical glitches, bandit raids, or perhaps Orc raiders testing the planet's defenses. But the raw scale of the readings could not be ignored. A low hum filled the room as the main display lit up with a horrific truth. Approaching the planet's outer orbit was a massive fleet of Tyranid ships. Not a fleet in the Imperial sense, where metal warships glinted in formation, but a living, pulsating mass of flesh, bone, and chitin. Massive hive ships, each the size of a small moon, moved with terrifying precision. Tendrils and spires of organic material lashed out from their hulls, sensing, probing, ready to adapt to any threat. "They're coming," muttered one of the younger officers, his voice barely audible over the hum of the scanners. "They're real." Varan's hands clenched. "Real doesn't begin to cover it. Alert the Planetary Governor, mobilize the defense regiments, and get me an Inquisitor on the line. Now." Meanwhile, on the surface, the first signs of the Tyranid threat had already begun to manifest. Farmers tending the eastern plains reported shadows in the forests, glimpses of movement that vanished when approached. Entire herds of livestock disappeared overnight, leaving only pools of blood and strange, acidic residue on the ground. Miners spoke of tunnels that seemed to rearrange themselves, as though the very land was alive and watching. Panic was slow to spread at first. Humans are resilient creatures, and denial often lasts longer than courage. But then came the attacks. The first villages fell not to massive assault, but to stealth and cunning. Gynostelas, Sinwi, four-limbed predators, struck under the cover of darkness. They entered homes through windows or ventilation shafts, seizing victims before anyone could sound the alarm. Witnesses who survived spoke of creatures with faces both alien and eerily human, like their claws slicing through bone and armor alike. The screams of these first nights echoed for weeks in the memory of the survivors, a sound that would never leave the minds of the planet's people. Lieutenant Captain Varan watched as reports poured in. Every defense measure seemed inadequate. Turrets fired upon the forests, but each Gynostela and Hormigaunt seemed to anticipate the gunfire, dodging, leaping, and retreating before a second volley could hit. When a squad of Imperial Guard was deployed to investigate a mining outpost, only one soldier returned, and even he was not entirely human anymore. His body had been partially consumed, twisted and fused with alien biomass. He could not speak, only shrieked, his eyes wide and blank as if he had been possessed. The Hive Mind, the central consciousness directing the Tyranid swarm, was learning. With each encounter it adapted, modifying the behavior of the Tyranid organisms to counter the Imperium strategies. Weapons that had worked on orcs or chaos daemons were suddenly useless. Flamers seared the bodies of Hormigaunts, yet the creatures' exoskeletons grew tougher. Lascannons vaporized Carnifexes, only for newer variants to emerge with reinforced carapaces. Every defensive maneuver became an exercise in futility. High above, in orbit, the Tyranid hive ships maneuvered as if aware of every move the Planetary Fleet made. Varan issued orders for orbital bombardments, hoping to break the first waves of attackers, but the Hive Fleet anticipated these strikes. Massive structures extended from the Hive ships, absorbing impacts, regenerating almost instantly, and retaliating with acidic projectiles that tore through the station's defenses. On Tarsis VII, fear began to take hold. The planet's governors and military leaders convened emergency councils, their voices trembling as the magnitude of the threat became undeniable. Evacuation plans were considered, but the civilian population alone numbered in the billions, and the Tyranids were already encroaching on every transport hub. Fear turned into chaos and chaos into panic. Riots broke out in cities as supplies ran low, communication lines failed, and the first refugees arrived with stories too terrible to believe. Entire towns erased overnight, forests shredded to their roots, rivers running red with the ichor of both humans and Tyranid creatures. Among the few prepared for this nightmare was Inquisitor Helena Voss. She had spent decades studying Tyranid behavior, gathering intelligence on Hive fleets that had passed through other systems. But even she was shaken. This Hive fleet Gryphon, she said, her voice sharp with barely contained fury. Hoot is unlike any we have encountered. Its intelligence is vast, its hunger limitless. Tarsis VII is in its path, and it will not be spared. Not one life will survive if we fail. The first large-scale engagement came in the northern forests. Imperial Guard regiments, supported by local planetary defense forces, attempted to hold the Tyranid advance at the riverlands. The battle began with artillery barrages, shells detonating into the dense swarms of hormagaunts and termagants. At first, the soldiers thought they had the advantage. Trench lines held, the enemy numbers seemed manageable. But the Tyranids were adaptive. From the ashes of the forest rose creatures they had never seen before, raveners, with elongated limbs and whip-like tails, leaping over barricades, tearing apart squads with terrifying precision. Lictors emerged silently from the shadows, assassinating officers before they could even give commands. The Hive Mind watched, calculated, and responded. In the cities, lictors infiltrated governance buildings, silently removing planetary leaders. Chaos erupted in the streets as civilians fled, and those who were too slow or too brave were dragged into alleys, their screams abruptly silenced. It was a psychological weapon as much as a physical one. Fear, terror, and despair spread faster than the Tyranid biomass. Back in orbit, Varen watched helplessly as orbital scans revealed the true scope of the invasion. Entire regions of the planet were being consumed. Forests were stripped bare, cities reduced to rubble, and rivers choked with organic matter. The Hive Mind pulsed like a living heart in the void, sending psychic signals that coordinated its swarm with precision. Each drop of blood, each cry of terror, was absorbed, analyzed, and used to refine the Tyranid assault. Varen's voice over the comms was tense but commanding. All units, fall back to secondary defensive positions. Preserve what forces you can. Evacuation protocols are now in effect. We may not be able to stop them, but we can survive if we are smart. Yet survival seemed increasingly unlikely. The Tyranids did not tire, they did not hesitate. They were the embodiment of hunger and adaptation, a force of nature with a singular purpose to consume all life on Tarsis VII. In the dead of night, the first settlers saw the sky change. A subtle glow appeared on the horizon, strange and alien, pulsing with a sickly light. Shadows moved unnaturally, and the forests seemed to whisper in an alien tongue. Some swore the world itself shivered under the weight of the approaching Hive Fleet. It was a warning the Tyranids were here, and their feast had begun. By the end of the first month, Tarsis VII was no longer a planet of order, of civilization, or even of hope. It had become a living nightmare, a stage for a predator beyond comprehension. Lieutenant Captain Varen, watching from orbit, understood the grim truth: conventional warfare was meaningless. The Hive Mind would adapt, evolve, and devour. The planet's defenses were irrelevant. Only one question remained: how long could humanity survive against a hunger that knew no end? The first signs had become the first screams, and those screams would echo across the galaxy, a harbinger of what the Tyranids would bring to every world in their path. The plains surrounding Nova Citadel had never seen such a concentration of human forces. Titan's artillery batteries and the sturdy lines of the Imperial Guard stretched for miles across the rolling hills, a tapestry of steel and discipline. At the center of it all, Lieutenant Captain Varen coordinated defenses from his command pod, orbiting above the planet. The sensors were alive with readings. Tyranid swarms had been detected moving toward the outer perimeter, and their numbers were incomprehensible. The Imperial Guard, veteran soldiers of 1,000 skirmishes, knew fear. but nothing could prepare them for the scale of what approached. Swarms of hormagaunts moved over the hills, their sinewy limbs lashing at the wind, skimming just above the ground in terrifying unison. Behind them, termagants advanced, launching plasma that scorched earth and flesh alike. The very air shimmered with the psychic resonance of the hive mind, a palpable weight pressing down on the soldiers, making them shiver with primal dread. Chaplain Drax stood atop a hill, bolter in hand, chanting prayers to the Emperor in a voice strong enough to pierce the terror-stricken air. His armor was scorched from previous encounters, yet he carried himself like a pillar of defiance. Around him, squads of guardsmen huddled behind sandbags and hastily erected barricades, every bolt and shell aimed at the oncoming swarm. The first wave hit like a storm. Flamers incinerated dozens of hormagaunts, their chitin crackling under the heat. Lasguns cut swaths through advancing termagants, and yet the creatures kept coming, driven by a relentless hunger. Every death seemed to birth new tactics. The Tyranids were learning, anticipating the firing patterns of the artillery, dodging shells, and leaping over fortifications that should have been insurmountable. "Hold the line!" Drax shouted, his voice ragged from the smoke and heat. "For the Emperor! For Tarsis VII!" From the forested edges of the battlefield, lictors emerged silently, stalking officers and heavy weapons teams. With a single strike, a lictor could decimate a squad, leaving behind nothing but shattered bone and terror. Imperial commanders struggled to maintain cohesion as their units were systematically torn apart by these unseen predators. High above, the orbital fleet made its presence known. Drop pods streaked through the sky, bringing space marines into the heart of the conflict. The Ultramarines had been dispatched as reinforcement, elite warriors capable of holding lines that mortal soldiers could not. They deployed from orbit with calculated precision, bolters blazing, chainswords revving, and jump packs propelling them into the thick of the swarms. Even so, the Tyranids adapted instantly. Carnifexes, towering monsters of muscle and chitin, smashed into squads with devastating force, tearing apart armored vehicles like toys. The city's defenses began to crack. Walls that had stood for centuries were pocked with acid burns, large chunks missing from sustained bombardment. Gaunts swarmed over the parapets, their relentless numbers threatening to overwhelm even the most disciplined units. Mortar crews fired blindly into the advancing horde, sometimes obliterating dozens of Tyranids, only to discover that new waves emerged moments later, their forms already evolved to withstand similar tactics. Varan's communications were a lifeline, though fragile and constantly interrupted. "All units," he barked, "fall back to secondary defensive positions. Preserve what forces you can. Evacuation points are now active. No one holds ground that cannot be defended." But even retreat was perilous. The Tyranids seemed to anticipate each move, cutting off escape routes with horrifying efficiency. Trigons burrowed beneath the battlefield, erupting through the soil in volcanic bursts to swallow entire platoons. Streets of Nova Citadel were filled with the chaos of battle explosions, screeching bio-weapons, and the cries of soldiers and civilians alike. In the command tent, Governor Ceres fought to maintain composure. Around him, aides and advisors debated evacuation strategies, their voices rising in panic. The citizen population of Nova Citadel numbered in the millions, and the Tyranids had already begun targeting food supplies, water reserves, and shelters. Panic, not enemy fire, was now claiming more lives than anything else. Chaplain Drax witnessed horrors that defied comprehension. Entire blocks of infantry were swallowed in seconds by swarming gaunts. Genestealers tore through elite squads with ease. Drax's own bodyguard veteran sergeants who had faced orcs, chaos marines, and heretics fell one by one. Every kill seemed to birth new threats. The hive mind was evolving with every engagement. Despite these setbacks, the defenders fought on. Titans launched volleys of macro cannons, ripping through Tyranid waves, their massive forms a bulwark against annihilation. Artillery fired tirelessly, each shell aiming to slow the tide of biomatter. Yet, every strike the Imperium delivered only spurred the Tyranids to adapt. When heavy flamers proved effective in one sector, the Hive Mind sent in bioforms resistant to heat. When las cannons destroyed Carnifexes, newer variants emerged with reinforced exoskeletons. It was as if the planet itself were under siege, with the Tyranids as its unstoppable immune system. In the western plains, civilians fled as refugee convoys were cut down by advancing swarms. Families were separated, and the wounded screamed for help that never came. Soldiers forced back tears to reload their weapons, to fire another salvo at the seemingly endless horde. Every second was a desperate struggle for survival. Above it all, the Hive Mind pulsed, a living command structure controlling the battlefield with psychic precision. Its influence was not limited to physical actions. It reached into the minds of the weak and terrified, amplifying fear, despair, and hopelessness. Some guardsmen went mad, turning on their comrades or fleeing into the jaws of the enemy. Others froze, paralyzed as Tyranid swarms enveloped them. The first breaches of Nova Citadel's walls came at dusk. A massive wave of Genestealers and Hormagaunts smashed through the outer barricades, ripping apart squads that had held for hours. The defenders fought with desperation bordering on insanity, yet the horde seemed infinite. Bioforms poured over the walls, and even elite Space Marine squads struggled to maintain the perimeter. Varen's voice over the comms was grim. Reinforcements from the north are unable to hold. The Hive Mind has concentrated on this sector. All units focus on protecting civilian evacuation points. Evacuation was chaos. Drop pods from orbit ferried survivors away, but the Tyranids adapted, targeting these escape routes with precision. Biovores fired acidic projectiles into landing zones, crushing transport vehicles and scattering fleeing populations. The sky was lit with fire, smoke, and the eerie bioluminescence of Tyranid organisms, a horrific aurora painting the heavens in sickly hues of green and red. In one of the city's central plazas, Chaplain Drax made a stand. He rallied the last remaining regiments, forming a defensive square around civilians. Bolter fire and chainsword strikes tore through the incoming waves, yet each kill felt hollow. For every Gaunt, every Hormagaunt, 10 more seemed to take its place. The Hive Mind responded to this resistance by sending forth its deadliest creatures yet, Tervigons, massive spawning beasts that birth hundreds of Gaunts mid-battle, turning pockets of resistance into slaughterhouses. Their psychic screams reverberated across the battlefield, disorienting soldiers and civilians alike. Artillery fire slowed their advance but could not destroy them completely. Their carcasses were absorbed into the biomass, feeding new growths. Night fell, and the battlefield became a hellish landscape of fire and shadow. Flames from burning vehicles illuminated the twisted forms of Tyranids moving through the chaos. Screams, explosions, and the shriek of alien predators filled the air. Survivors spoke of seeing the sky crawl with organisms, raveners flying overhead, scouting and striking, their limbs slicing through troops with terrifying efficiency. Varen, monitoring the battle from orbit, realized the grim truth: Nova Citadel would not hold. The defenders were brave, disciplined, and relentless, but the Tyranids were more than a foe. They were a force of nature. No strategy, no reinforcements, no heroic stand could stop an adaptive predator with infinite patience and singular purpose. He relayed his final orders for the day. All units, withdraw to secondary fortifications. Evacuate as many civilians as possible. The Hive Mind will not be deterred, but we can survive if we live to fight another day. Even as he spoke, reports came in of breaches in the city's walls, casualties mounting in the thousands. Chaplain Drax's voice over the comms was steady, but filled with sorrow. The Emperor protects, but here, he watches, and we die. By the end of the first week of the siege, Nova Citadel had become a city of fire, blood, and terror. Streets that had once been centers of commerce were now rivers of ichor and corpses. Forests on the outskirts were stripped bare. The Hive Mind pulsed with satisfaction, its psychic signals coordinating each move of the swarm with terrifying intelligence. The Tyranid invasion had begun in earnest, and Tarsis VII was on the brink of annihilation. The siege was only the first step in the planet's consumption, a grim prologue to the horrors yet to come. The soldiers, civilians, and Space Marines still fighting understood one thing: this was no battle. It was extinction incarnate. And every second they survived was borrowed time, hanging by the thinnest thread against an enemy that adapted, evolved, and consumed without mercy. The smoke from the siege hung thick over Nova Citadel, a suffocating blanket that clung to streets and alleys like a living thing. The city, once a jewel of Tarsis VII, now resembled a corpse slowly rotting in sunlight and fire. Buildings that had stood for centuries were shattered, their stone facades scarred by acid burns and shell impacts. Streets had become rivers of ash and echre, littered with the bodies of soldiers, civilians, and Tyranid organisms alike. Chaplain Drax moved through the ruins with a small squad of surviving guardsmen. Their armor was blackened with soot, torn and scorched, and their weapons were scorched and dented from continuous combat. Yet, even amidst exhaustion and terror, Drax's voice carried through the chaos. "Hold your lines, men! For the Emperor! No surrender!" But the Tyranids did not respect lines. They did not march. They flowed, a single, coordinated organism of bone, sinew, and insatiable hunger. The Hive Mind, a psychic presence pulsing from the Hive ships above, orchestrated every movement with terrifying intelligence. Where soldiers expected a frontal assault, the Tyranids emerged from the shadows, tunneling beneath streets, dropping from rooftops, or appearing where the defenders least expected them. It began in the industrial sector. Factories that had once produced machinery and weapons now became death traps. Ripper swarms slithered through ventilation shafts, their tiny jaws shredding anything in their path. Soldiers were dragged screaming into the machinery, their bodies torn apart as alarms blared uselessly over the chaos. The clang of steel against steel, the shriek of torches, and the crackle of bolter fire mingled with screams into a cacophony of horror. Drax's squad fought desperately, bolters blazing, grenades thrown into dens of swarming gaunts, flamers burning the advancing hormagaunts. For a moment, it seemed the human forces might hold. But then came the Trigons, massive tunneling predators that erupted from below the factory floors in volcanic bursts, swallowing squads whole. The ground itself seemed to rebel against the defenders, opening to consume them. "Keep moving! Cover the civilians!" Drax shouted, holding a wounded guardsman over his shoulder. Around him, his remaining squad members fired into the swarms, their ammunition dwindling. Every kill seemed to provoke an evolution. Gaunts emerged with thicker carapaces, claws sharper than before, and acid glands that sprayed corrosive substances capable of melting through armor. In one sector, a Tervigon emerged from the rubble. Towering over the buildings, it birthed countless gaunts mid-battle, its psychic screech disorienting soldiers and civilians alike. Bolter fire tore into its flesh, plasma lances seared its sinewy limbs, yet it continued to spawn, seemingly endless. Men fell around it, torn apart by claw bite, or the crushing weight of the monstrosity itself. Varen, observing from orbit, felt a sick dread in his chest. The Hive Mind was no longer merely coordinating its forces, it was learning at an exponential rate. Every tactic the Imperium employed was countered almost immediately. Where artillery destroyed a Tyranid nest, new variants emerged immune to the same weapons. Where bolter fire decimated Gynostealers, their replacements moved faster, struck harder, and attacked in more coordinated patterns. The planet's defenders were being studied, analyzed, and destroyed systematically. Meanwhile, in the civilian districts, chaos reigned. Streets were clogged with refugees, many of them lost, separated, or dying from injuries. Food supplies had run out days ago, and fires consumed warehouses where grain and rations had been stored. The Tyranids, sensing concentrated life, diverted swarms to these areas. Lictors slithered through alleyways, Gynostealers leapt from rooftops, and the cries of the innocent echoed across the ruins. Mothers clutched children, bolters rattled in the streets, and the smell of burning flesh mingled with the acidic stench of Tyranid echre. Chaplain Drax fought his way toward the central industrial zone, determined to rescue as many civilians as possible. He and his squad entered a factory where hundreds of terrified workers had barricaded themselves. Flamers roared, bolters spat fire, and grenades tore holes in the walls. For hours they fought, pushing back the Tyranid swarms, yet the creatures adapted to every strategy. Where the chaplain expected a corridor to be safe, Gynostealers appeared from shadows, striking with surgical precision. Soldiers fell, civilians screamed, and the factory became a tomb. Outside, the skyline was alive with bioluminescent horrors. Raveners flew across rooftops, scouting and striking with whip-like tails. Hive ships pulsated in orbit, releasing waves of bio-projectiles that destroyed entire blocks of the city. Varen's fleet attempted orbital bombardment, but the Hive Mind absorbed each strike, reinforcing its nodes and redirecting the swarms to unscathed areas. By the second week, the city was no longer recognizable. Streets were clogged with biomass, rivers of ichor, and the corpses of both humans and Tyranids. Fires burned unchecked, and the air was thick with smoke, spores, and the acrid stench of acid. Bolter fire echoed endlessly, a desperate symphony of resistance against an enemy that had no fear, no pain, no hesitation. Varen issued urgent orders. Concentrate remaining forces on key defensive points. Protect civilians at all costs. Do not engage in hopeless assaults. But even evacuation was perilous. Trigons erupted near drop zones, crushing transports in seconds. Biovores fired acid into landing areas, disintegrating vehicles and scattering survivors. Every attempt to save lives was met with new horrors, each designed to maximize fear and destruction. Chaplain Drax's squad made a last desperate attempt to secure a factory holding civilians. They fought through corridors thick with Tyranid biomass, walls slick with echo. The soldiers were exhausted, their bodies torn, their morale shattered, yet they pressed on. Every kill of a Gaunt or Hormagaunt was only temporary, more always came. The Hive Mind had learned from every engagement, refining the attack patterns, exploiting weak points, and overwhelming the defenders with intelligence no human command could match. Drax himself bore the brunt of the psychic assault. The Hive Mind's presence weighed on his mind, amplifying fear, despair, and doubt. He saw visions of failure, of Nova Citadel falling, of billions consumed. Yet, through the psychic fog, he focused on the mission: protect the innocent, delay the enemy, and buy time for evacuation. The city's walls finally collapsed in the industrial district. Bolter fire and grenades slowed the Tyranids, but they surged forward like an ocean of living death. Civilians screamed as swarms poured into the streets. Drax's squad formed a desperate defensive line, fighting to the last man. Each step forward was bought with blood, each second of delay a small victory against impossible odds. Varen's voice came through the comms, strained and tense. Chaplain Drax, extraction points are overwhelmed. You cannot hold the industrial zone. Evacuate with what civilians you can, or the Hive Mind will consume all. Drax knew the truth. The Hive Mind's adaptation was complete. Artillery had failed. Bolters had failed. Titans had slowed the advance but could not stop it. Every defense the Imperium had relied on was meaningless against a force that evolved in real time, learning from every tactic, predicting every move, and striking with terrifying intelligence. Even as the survivors fled, the Hive Mind pursued, sending forth Tervigons, Carnifexes, and endless swarms of Gaunts. Each new organism adapted instantly, making the battlefield a living, evolving nightmare. Streets once filled with the sounds of commerce and life were now death traps. Fires, acid, and screams marked every step. By the third week, Nova Citadel had been reduced to a shattered labyrinth of rubble and bio-matter. The industrial zone, the first bastion of human resistance, was gone. Factories and warehouses were no longer buildings, they were nurseries for Tyranid biomass, churning out Gaunts and Hormagaunts to replace losses. Every corner of the city had been infiltrated, every alley and corridor claimed by the Hive Mind. Varen's orbital fleet could do nothing but watch. Evacuation was ongoing, but slower than the Tyranids' relentless pursuit. The Hive Mind adapted to orbital strikes, dispersing swarms to avoid destruction. Where planetary defenses had failed, Varen's remaining titans of space and ship firepower could only delay the inevitable. Chaplain Drax, battered and bloodied, led the last surviving civilians toward the evacuation points. He looked back once, toward the city he had sworn to defend, and saw it consumed by biomass. Fires burned bright against the dark sky, and the psychic presence of the Hive Mind was all-encompassing. Tarsis VII had begun its transformation from civilized world to feeding ground. The defenders' morale shattered, the survivors' hope dwindled. The Hive Mind had proven that no strategy, no heroism, no sacrifice could halt its advance. Every day, every hour, the planet's life was consumed, and the Tyranids evolved to ensure nothing could stand in their path. By the end of Chapter 3, Nova Citadel was a city of horror, a place where human ingenuity and courage were powerless against an adaptive predator. The industrial zones were tombs, the streets rivers of echo, and the air thick with the psychic presence of the Hive Mind. Tarsis V was dying, and the galaxy far beyond its orbit would one day hear of this tragedy, not as a battle, but as an extinction, a warning of the hunger that stalked the stars. The sun barely pierced the smoke, choked skies above Nova Citadel. The once proud city now lay in ruins, shattered buildings, twisted metal, and rivers of Tyranid ichor flowed through the streets like a grotesque reflection of the rivers that had once nourished the land. Fires burned unchecked, casting flickering shadows over the skeletal remains of the Imperial Guard. The air was thick with the stench of death, of burnt flesh, and the acrid scent of Tyranid acid. At the highest point of the city stood the fortress monastery of St. Enoch, a massive bastion carved from the very bedrock of Tarsis VII. Here, the remaining Imperial defenders, Imperial Guard, Space Marines, and desperate survivors made their final stand. Titans, both human engineered and planetary defense class, lined the surrounding hills, their weapons trained on the advancing Tyranid tide. Artillery batteries roared continuously, firing shells that tore through swarming gaunts by the hundreds. Yet the Hive Mind adapted with terrifying efficiency, sending larger and more resilient creatures in response. Chaplain Drax, battered, bloodied, and nearly unrecognizable from the earlier battles, he stood at the monastery gates. His armor was scorched and dented, the emblem of the Emperor barely visible beneath layers of soot and ichor. Around him, the last surviving soldiers of his battalion prepared for what would likely be their final fight. Listen well. Drax's voice boomed across the ruined courtyard. The Emperor watches over us, and we shall die with honor. Every inch we hold gives our people a chance. Every shot fired, every monster slain, is a blow against the Hive Mind itself. The soldiers responded with shouted oaths and prayers, their morale fragile yet bolstered by the chaplain's unwavering presence. Around them, the monstrous shadows of Tyranid Carnifexes and Tervigons moved across the hills, accompanied by swarms of Hormagaunts and Genestealers. The Hive Mind's psychic resonance pulsed in the defenders' minds, amplifying fear and despair, yet also fueling a furious determination they would not yield easily. The battle began with the sound of artillery and cannon fire. Titans unleashed volleys of macro-cannon shells, vaporizing swaths of Tyranids. Bioforms lobbed acid globules from afar, disintegrating enemy clusters before they reached the fortress walls. Yet for every Tyranid destroyed, more appeared. The Hive Mind's adaptive evolution was now fully apparent. Creatures emerged from burrows, tunnels, and the shadows with carapaces hardened against heavy bolt of fire, claws sharpened to shred armor, and psychic abilities that disoriented and terrified the defenders. Chaplain Drax led a squad to reinforce the southern wall, where the Tyranids had concentrated their assault. Genestealers leapt from rubble and shadows, tearing into guardsmen before bolt of fire could reach them. Flamers spat torrents of fire, cutting down swarms, but even these weapons were only momentarily effective. Drax's squad fought with fury, bayonets and chainswords carving through the relentless tide, each kill a fleeting victory in the face of overwhelming odds. High above, Lieutenant Captain Varen's orbital command relayed updates and coordinated remaining strikes. All orbital bombardments focus on the southern approach, he ordered. Cover the evacuation routes at all costs. Massive dropships attempted to land to extract civilians, but the Hive Mind's coordination disrupted every attempt. Ripper swarms tore through landing zones, trigons burst from the ground to crush transport vehicles, and acid fire melted the hulls of several remaining Titans. From the eastern hills came the first of the Hive Mind's ultimate bioforms, Hierophant Bio, Titans, towering monstrosities whose limbs crushed Imperial Titans and artillery pieces like toys. Each step sent tremors across the battlefield, knocking soldiers off their feet. Bolters and las cannons barely scratched their thick carapaces. Flamers and plasma weapons were absorbed or deflected by the alien organism's bio-armoring. Drax realized that conventional defenses would not hold. Every attempt to repel the swarm was met with an immediate adaptation. The Hive Mind was learning, evolving, and countering the tactics of the defenders in real time. Yet, despite the hopelessness, the defenders continued to fight. Survival was no longer the goal, only resistance, only buying time for civilians to escape, mattered now. In the central plaza, the first evacuation units gathered survivors, huddling them into transport pods. Families screamed, children cried, and the wounded were carried or dragged towards safety. Drax assigned squads to protect these points, holding choke points in streets and alleys, often at the cost of their own lives. The battle reached its horrific climax as the Tyranids unleashed Tervigons at multiple points around the monastery. These colossal creatures birthed hundreds of gaunts mid-battle, replenishing losses almost instantly. Imperial forces were cut down, and even elite space marines were forced to retreat under the relentless tide. Drax rallied his squad for a desperate counterattack, chainsword roaring, bolt of fire deafening as they carved through the advancing horde. Yet for every monster slain, more seemed to emerge from the shadows. Varen, watching from orbit, realized that even his orbital fleet could do little more than slow the advance. The Hive Mind had adapted to energy bombardments, dispersing its forces to minimize casualties. Titans on the surface engaged the Hierophants directly, but even their devastating firepower was insufficient. Each blast only drove the alien monstrosities to shift tactics, attacking weak points in human formations, tearing down fortifications and creating chaos. By nightfall, Nova Citadel's walls were breached. Swarms poured into the inner city, cutting through defenders with horrifying efficiency. Chaplain Drax and his squad fought desperately, covering retreating civilians as explosions and projectiles tore through the streets. Flames from burning buildings illuminated the nightmare below. Bodies, human and Tyranid, intermixed in rivers of fire and ichor. Seeing the city fall, Drax made a grim decision. He gathered his remaining squad and took a forward position to cover the final evacuation. "Go!" he shouted to the civilians and surviving guardsmen. "Go while you can! The Emperor protects the brave." His squad formed a defensive line, bolt of fire and chainswords tearing into the endless wave of gaunts and genestealers. The Hive Mind responded by sending forth its deadliest assassins, lictors, which leapt silently onto rooftops and into the streets, striking at officers and artillery crews with surgical precision. Drax fought through their attacks, but one claw caught him in the shoulder, tearing armor and flesh alike. Blood poured as he continued forward, each step agony, each breath a prayer. Above the battlefield, the Hive ships pulsed with psychic energy, guiding the swarms like conductors leading an orchestra of death. They coordinated drops of Carnifexes and Tervigons with precision, cutting off escape routes, overwhelming defensive positions, and ensuring no reinforcements could break through. The city was being methodically consumed. Varen's voice cut through the comms, tense and grim. "Extraction points are collapsing! No further civilians can be safely removed. All surviving units fall back to secondary positions in the northern hills." Drax's squad fought through the streets, bolt of fire cutting through the darkness. They formed barricades with debris, pushing back the Tyranid tide as long as possible. Each kill was a momentary victory. Each second gained allowed another handful of civilians to reach safety. But the Hive Mind's presence was overwhelming. Every maneuver, every tactic employed by humans was anticipated, countered, and rendered nearly useless. As dawn approached, the northern hills became the final bastion. Survivors, soldiers, and civilians huddled in makeshift fortifications, titans and artillery in place to hold the last line. The Hive Mind concentrated all remaining forces for a decisive assault. Carnifexes smashed through barricades, Tervigons birthed countless jaunts, and Hierophant Titans advanced like unstoppable mountains of flesh. Drax, bloodied and exhausted, stood with his last squad at the hilltop. "This is the end, but we fight! For the Emperor! For Tarsis VII!" He raised his bolter high, the weapon's muzzle spitting fire into the advancing horrors. Around him, soldiers and marines followed suit, a desperate roar of defiance. The Hive Mind unleashed its final assault. The ground trembled as titans clashed with monstrous bioforms, bolters roared, flamers spat fire, and plasma cut through alien sinew. Yet every strike was absorbed, adapted to, and countered. The defenders fell, one by one, in a cascade of fire and blood. Drax's squad was decimated, each man giving their life to hold the line as civilians fled through the northern corridors to the last remaining drop pods. Finally, Chaplain Drax, standing alone atop the hill, faced the looming shadow of a Hierophant Titan. His bolter was empty, his armor shattered, yet he raised his chainsword, a single figure of defiance against the monstrous tide. The creature advanced, each step cracking stone beneath its weight. Drax's eyes blazed with fury and faith. "The Emperor watches," he shouted, before the creature's claws struck, and the hill was swallowed in a wave of flesh and bone. The Hive Mind had consumed Nova Citadel. Every street, every building, every defensive line had been erased. Fires burned across the ruins, the psychic resonance of the Hive Mind pulsing like a heartbeat. The few survivors carried the memory of heroism and horror alike, their escape a fleeting victory against an unstoppable predator. By the end of Chapter 4, Tarsis VI was almost entirely lost. The fortress monastery had fallen, the titans destroyed or scattered, and the Hive Mind's adaptive strategy had proven unstoppable. The planet itself seemed to cry under the assault, its life force being consumed and catalogued by the Tyranids for their next conquest. Nova Citadel, once a bastion of human civilization, was now a tomb of fire, blood, and alien biomass. And above it all, the Hive Mind pulsed, sending signals across the galaxy. Its hunger had not been sated, its evolution ongoing, and its conquest inevitable. The skies over Tarsis VII were empty now, save for the distant Hive ships drifting in orbit like bloated, alien moons. Smoke and ash choked the air, the acrid stench of burnt flesh and acid lingering over the planet's scarred surface. Nova Citadel, once the heart of civilization on Tarsis VII, had ceased to exist. Its walls were shattered, its streets rivers of ichor and biomass, and its factories, once humming with life, had been turned into nurseries for Tyranid spawn. Lieutenant, Captain Varen's command station hovered above the planet, now a lonely bastion in the void. From orbit, he watched the devastation unfold in silence. Orbital scans revealed the horrifying reality. The Tyranid Hive Mind had fully consumed the industrial zones, the forests, the cities, and the plains. The biomass had been absorbed into the Hive Fleet's growing structure, feeding its endless hunger. Reports from scattered survivors were fragmentary, whispered across broken comms. Few had made it off the planet alive. Refugee pods drifted in orbit, carrying those who had escaped the final assaults. Faces were pale, eyes wide with trauma. Many spoke little. The screams of their friends, the horrors they had witnessed, had left them silent. Every story was the same. The city fell in waves of alien violence, the defenders were slaughtered, and the Hive Mind adapted instantly to every tactic. Chaplain Drax's sacrifice had become legend among the survivors. His squad, and every other unit that had formed a last line of defense, had been annihilated to allow civilians to escape. Though he had fallen, the courage of his stand had bought precious time, enabling dozens of pods to leave the planet. Varen's logs recorded the bitter truth: Tarsis V was lost, but not entirely. Some lives had survived. That faint ember of hope, however small, was enough to fuel the stories that would reach the Imperium. The Hive Mind's influence on the planet was now complete. Where cities had stood, there were now nurseries of chitin and flesh, teeming with Tyranid bioforms. Forests had been stripped bare, replaced with alien spires and tunnels. Rivers ran red, carrying organic waste that nourished the growing biomass. The psychic presence of the Hive Mind pulsed across the planet, a tangible weight in the minds of any survivors still nearby. Every action, every movement on Tarsis VII was now catalogued and integrated into the Hive Mind's ever-growing intelligence. From orbit, Varen could see the final stages of adaptation. The Tyranids had begun to restructure the planet's surface to maximize feeding efficiency. Hive nodes expanded outward from the cities, connecting forests, plains, and riverbeds into a vast, integrated system. Each node functioned as a living processing center, breaking down organic material and converting it into nourishment for the Hive Fleet. What remained of Tarsis VI's life force was now data for the Hive Mind, a record of the planet's ecology, its species and its defenses, ready to inform the Tyranids' next assault. Within the remaining refugee pods, survivors were shell-shocked, traumatized, and mourning. Families had been ripped apart, friends slain, entire units of guardsmen annihilated. Many spoke of nightmares, visions of the Hive Mind reaching into their minds, the psychic echoes of its intelligence leaving a permanent mark. Those who survived would forever carry the knowledge that no matter how brave, how resourceful, or how loyal to the Emperor, humanity was vulnerable to a predator that could evolve faster than any weapon could kill it. The orbital fleet attempted to salvage what they could. Stragglers were retrieved, Titans salvaged if possible, and critical data recovered. Yet even these efforts were overshadowed by the psychological weight of the loss. Varen's logs were grim, detailing the near-total extinction of Tarsis VI's population and infrastructure. Reports described children and elderly carried aboard dropships, mute and shaking, clutching scorched remnants of their homes. Soldiers documented the horror of the Hive Mind's efficiency, its ability to anticipate, adapt, and consume with a single-minded purpose. Beyond the immediate trauma, the Hive Mind's victory had long-term consequences. Varen noted in his log, "The Hive Fleet has learned. The adaptations it employed here will inform its next assaults. Systems across this sector are now at risk. Tarsis VI is a warning to the Imperium. The Tyranids do not merely destroy, they evolve, catalog, and prepare for the next world." Communication networks still attempted to reach other Imperial systems, but most signals were lost in the chaos. Those that did arrive brought grim tidings. Nova Citadel's fall was now known across the sector. News traveled quickly among planetary governors, military commanders, and the Inquisition. Some denied it, refusing to believe that a Hive fleet could obliterate a fully fortified world. Others, in whispered tones, accepted the horror. The Tyranids were an unstoppable predator, consuming all in their path, and no world could be considered safe. The survivors aboard the evacuation pods were left to grapple with their trauma. Some prayed endlessly, clutching religious icons, begging the Emperor for forgiveness or mercy. Others remained silent, staring at the void of space, haunted by visions of carnage. Many would never speak of what they had seen, for words could not capture the scale of the horror. The Hive Mind had claimed not just the planet, but the souls and minds of those who had witnessed its advance. From orbit, Varron recorded one final entry. Tarsis VII is lost. The Hive Mind's victory is complete. Its bioforms now dominate every inch of the planet's surface. The city, the industrial zones, the forests, all have been converted into biomass, feeding the Hive Fleet's endless hunger. Survivors are few, traumatized and scarred, yet they carry a warning: this enemy does not fight in ways we understand. It adapts, evolves, and will strike again. The Imperium must prepare, for the Tyranids will not rest, and neither can we. On the planet below, the Hive Mind pulsed like a heartbeat, its psychic presence stretching into orbit and beyond. Signals, patterns, and knowledge from Tarsis VII had been integrated into its consciousness. Every defensive measure, every weapon employed against it, every tactic attempted by humans had been catalogued, analyzed, and countered. The Hive Fleet had grown smarter, hungrier, and more efficient, and somewhere in the void of space, the Tyranid ships began their next maneuver, drifting toward the next unsuspecting world. Tarsis V was gone, its life consumed, yet its death was only a chapter in the endless saga of Tyranid hunger. The survivors, few in number, forever scarred, drifted in orbit, carrying with them the memory of bravery, horror, and loss. They were the witnesses of extinction, tasked with the impossible responsibility of warning the Imperium of a threat that could not be stopped, only delayed. As the last signals of human presence faded from the planet's surface, the Hive Mind pulsed again. Every creature, every structure, every shred of biomass was now part of a greater organism, a living network of adaptation and hunger. Tarsis VI's forests, plains, and cities had been devoured, leaving nothing but a transformed landscape, a feeding ground for the next wave, a blueprint for the Hive Mind's eternal campaign. In the darkness of space, among the remnants of Tarsis VI, the only sound was the psychic heartbeat of a predator that never tires. The galaxy would soon hear its call again. The Hive Mind's hunger was infinite, its conquest unstoppable, and its evolution relentless.